Hi, I'm writer and actor Tom Conkle, and you are listening to a podcast named Scooby-Doo.
Yeah.
The gang's all here, they're on the case, and there's no ghost that they wouldn't face, 'cause they dig it, Scooby-Doo. Yeah, they dig it, Scooby-Doo.
Hey gang, and welcome to another episode of a podcast named Scooby-Doo, the show that attempts to unravel 50 years of mysteries, meddling kids, and masked villains. My name is Mike Josick, and I'll be your guide through all things ghostly and groovy as I investigate every angle of every mystery and beyond. So grab yourself some Scooby snacks, fire up the mystery machine, and let's start the show.
Let's look down here. Follow me.
Here we are at episode 33 of the podcast. I'm glad that you can join me for part 2 of my ongoing conversation with Scooby-Doo writer, comic book writer, television show writer, all-around writer, and pop culture historian, Mark Evanier. Now this episode, like the last episode, if you're joining me from episode 1, usually I say if you haven't listened to episode 1, like, what are you doing? Technically, the way these break down, you probably could just listen to these individually and still get like a really good kind of hour-long interview conversation between two people. And they are sort of split somewhat thematically, so I'm kind of thinking out loud here. But anyways, it's a long one. It's another long one. We're looking at about another hour-long chunk of the conversation, so I want to keep it kind of brief. I don't want to spend a lot of time jabbering on, so I'm just going to say, glad you're back. If this is your first time here, welcome. Go check out part 1. It's really cool. And part 2 revolves primarily around the development of Scrappy, the casting of Scrappy, talking about Mark's writing of animation and animation pilots. And there's some great stuff at the end about Frank Welker, which I'd actually forgotten that we'd talked about. And as I was editing it, it just kind of made me all warm and fuzzy thinking about Frank. I hope it does the same for you. So without further ado, head on into part 2 of my conversation with Mark Evanier, and I will catch you for my outro on the other side. Joe Barbera has often said that their experience with bringing live-action writers in to write the animated shows, they just couldn't write chases. They just couldn't get the rhythms of the show. Well, do you think that might have had something to do with that?
It had an awful lot to do with it, yeah. What happened, my experience with the studio was that every so often, they decide, we got to make our shows better. Let's hire some of those primetime hit writers, the guys who write hit, primetime shows. And they'd hire some guys who had some credits on primetime TV shows, and some of the shows would be good and some of them wouldn't be. And they'd say, well, let's see if we can do better. Let's only hire guys with animation backgrounds, no more live action writers. And they'd hire all live action writers, or all animation guys, and some of the shows would be good and some of them wouldn't. I think the batting average was about the same either way. Some of these guys could do it and some of them couldn't. And also, there were other factors. Some of the Hanna-Barbera shows weren't very good because they were just lousy ideas. And some of the Hanna-Barbera shows weren't that good because they were animated, in a Quonset hut someplace. They were done by very bad animation, cheap, crummy animation. And, the script was not always the determining factor. I mean, I worked on some shows that nobody could have made good. I mean, the premise of the show and the deadlines and the fact that nobody really knew what the show was, you couldn't. It was impossible to do anything worthwhile on those shows because they were just doomed from the start. That happens occasionally. But the first time I was hired to write anything for Hanna-Barbera, now this is going to get way away from Scooby for a second. But when I started writing sitcoms, I had a partner, a fellow named Dennis Palumbo, lovely man. We're still friends. You'll see his credit on the movie My Favorite Year. He now writes mystery novels, and he's a psychotherapist. He's a very popular busy psychotherapist in Hollywood. And we sold an idea for a TV show to Hanna-Barbera, their live-action department. They had a live-action department there, and that was the first thing I did for Hanna-Barbera directly. I think that actually even predated the comic books for the studio. This is while Chase was still in retirement and Charlton was doing the comic books. And so I did that, and then subsequently I got hired to write a live-action pilot for Hanna-Barbera. They wanted to do a TV show. I did a TV show, a pilot for them. I co-wrote it with a lady named Marion Freeman called The Beach Girls. It was a sitcom about 3 cute girls who wear bikinis and had a rock group. And we did the pilot, and it turned out awful. The one saving grace of it was that one of the actresses in it was very wonderful, and a lot of people listening to this will know her name as Rita Wilson.
Yes.
A.K.A. Mrs. Tom Hanks. She was in the pilot, and she was fabulous. If everybody in the show had been as good as her, it would have been a hit. But that's when I met Joe Barbera. When I met Joe Barbera, I was the editor of the Hanna-Barbera comic book department, and I was a live-action writer who was sold to him as a great writer of situation comedies and who'd written primetime shows. And he kept thinking, I'm a live-action writer. Even though I explained to him that I wrote the Scooby-Doo comic book, and I wrote the Flintstones comic book, even though he and I would talk about old Hanna-Barbera shows, and he was startled that I knew what Wilma Flintstone's maiden name was, and things like that. I really knew Hanna-Barbera stuff very well. It just didn't sink into him that I was a guy who was a candidate to write animation shows. So after the Beach Girls washed up on shore, I got hired by Sid and Marty Krofft to do a show for them called the Krofft Superstar Hour, which was a show on NBC. It later changed its name to the Bay City Rollers Show. And the lady who was producing it was a woman named Bonnie Dorr, who had previously been a executive at ABC in the children's department. She'd previously been one of the people who bought shows for Saturday morning. And we're working on this live-action show with H.R. Pufnstuf and the Bay City Rollers and, some of the past Krofft characters. And she says to me one day, Mark, why aren't you writing cartoons? You're really qualified for that. And I explained to her that Joe Barbera thought I was a live-action writer. So she said, well, you want to work for Ruby Spears? Joe Ruby and Ken Spears, who started Scooby-Doo, and a lot of other Hanna-Barbera shows like Captain Caveman and Dynamite, and now had their own studio. And she was good friends with them. So this one day, she said, you want to write for Ruby Spears? And I said, sure. She picks up the phone, she calls Joe Ruby, and she says, you looking for a writer? And Joe says, yeah, I just got an ABC weekend special to produce, and I got to find someone to do the script. And she says, I got the guy. And Joe said, send him over. By dumb chance, the Krofft offices where we were working were way out in Sun Valley, which is an area where there's no show business. It's all like muffler shops and taco stands. But they was out there because it was cheap real estate, and the Krofft had this big factory where they built all their costumes and props, so they're out there. That's where we were working. And about 2 blocks away was the Ruby Spears Animation Studio, because it was cheap real estate. If you're going to build a big building, you build it out someplace where the real estate's cheap. So I literally walked from the Krofft offices over to Joe Ruby's office and became an animation writer. And so I wrote ABC Weekend Specials, and then I wrote the Plastic Man show.
Right.
And I wrote other things for Ruby and Spears. And one day, they were trying to sell a new season of Scooby-Doo. ABC was hesitant to pick up Scooby-Doo for another season because they were afraid the show was getting stale. They were afraid there were no new stories to do. They were afraid people were getting sick of it. And the studio, mostly Joe Barbera, had come up with this new character called Scrappy-Doo. And I did not create Scrappy-Doo. He existed before I entered the picture. And they had written a couple of scripts with Scrappy-Doo, and the ABC said, no, we don't like this. No, we don't like this. No, we don't like this. And he went to, their agent went to ABC and said, look, please, tell us what to do. We really want to sell another season of Scooby-Doo. And one of the development people at ABC said, listen, there's this writer that we've been using on some of the Ruby Spears show who's really, seems to have some good ideas. Why don't you hire him? His name is Mark Evanier. And they told us to Joe Barbera, and he said, Mark Evanier, he doesn't write cartoons. And I get this call one day from Joe Barbera saying, why didn't you tell me you wrote cartoons? And I said, I did. You didn't listen to me. So the next thing I know, I'm in Joe Barbera's office working on Scrappy-Doo. And I wrote the pilot that convinced ABC to order another season of Scooby-Doo via the addition of Scrappy. And that's how I, became, a Hanna-Barbera writer of things other than live action and comic books.
Something that I was really...
So there's the story you wanted.
Yes. Something that I was kind of really hoping that you might have an answer to. I'd interviewed Dwayne Poole a little while ago, and he was talking about the early conversations about Scrappy, and he had said that Joe and Ken were actually in the room, but I thought that Joe and Ken had their own studio at the time.
Yeah,
but I
Joe
didn't.
And Ken had their own studio. Joe and Ken left Hanna-Barbera. Well, they left Hanna-Barbera and they worked for DePatie Freeling for a while on the Planet of the Apes cartoon show. They worked on the prime-time Planet of the Apes show, too, I believe.
Oh, the live-action one?
And the live-action one. They worked on that show also. And they also, there's an odd thing here, and here's the reason that it could be a little confusing. One of the problems you had at Hanna-Barbera in those days is that they were selling shows to all three networks. So frequently, the ABC show at 9 o'clock was a Hanna-Barbera show, the CBS show at 9 o'clock was a Hanna-Barbera show, and the NBC show at 9 o'clock was a Hanna-Barbera show. They were competing with themselves. And they were producing a lot of shows, and they didn't, there's better artists, and there's better producers, and there's better subcontracting studios than others. And I think this was started by Fred Silverman at CBS. He said to his people at CBS, you can't just let Hanna-Barbera produce the shows. They'll put their worst people on our shows. So you've got to go in and we've got to become the producers. So they would go in, and that's why you heard about all this network control that was there. When the network was reading every script and making notes on everything and giving comments on everything and approving everything. Yeah. If you look at any interview with Joe Barbera from that period, he just wails and complains about how the network was controlling their shows. Well, the reason the network was controlling the shows was that they were afraid that they weren't going to get your best efforts, Joe. As you know, a lot of these shows were farmed out to other studios to animate. Some of them were animated in the Philippines. Some of them were animated in Australia. Some of them were animated in Korea. Some of them were animated in, bizarre places. So if you didn't want your show to go to the crummy studio, you had to build that into the contract. And literally, ABC would say, we will pick up this show, but you can't have it animated by this studio overseas. And you can't, you've got to give us this producer, and you've got to, the network felt they had to exercise that control in order to get the best material.
Makes sense.
And sometimes, the animation on the first season with Scrappy-Doo was deemed to be substandard. ABC hated it. They said you gave our show to the crummy studios to do. You didn't give us the best artists, and actually they did give them the best artists. It was mostly the studio that did it, but they were very unhappy with the animation. When Cartoon Network began running Scooby-Doo, whenever Cartoon Network started doing that, they didn't run that season of Scrappy for the first 2 or 3 years. They skipped over it on the premise that by the time they introduced it into the mix, the fact that it had not been rerun to death would compensate for the fact that the animation wasn't as good. You follow me on that? They thought, well, let's save this for when the kids are desperate for something they haven't seen already. And a lot of the shows the network just wasn't happy with. At one point, in order to get the best people on their shows, the networks would make contracts with people. So, for example, they decided at ABC that the best shows that were coming out of Hanna-Barbera were the ones that were produced by Joe Ruby and Ken Spears. So ABC hired Joe Ruby and Ken Spears to make them exclusive to ABC and then loaned them back to Hanna-Barbera to produce the shows. When Joe Ruby and Ken Spears were producing Jabberjaw and Dynamite. I don't know the exact period they started doing this, but at some point there, like on Dynamite or Captain Caveman, maybe not Captain Caveman, on some of these points where Joe Ruby and Ken Spears produced the shows at Hanna-Barbera, Joe Ruby and Ken Spears were on the network payroll, not on Hanna-Barbera's, or they were paid jointly. But the point was that Hanna-Barbera could not assign them to an NBC or CBS show.
Interesting.
And because they had that reputation and they were thought of as guys who produced hit shows, they were able to start their own studio with funding from a company called Filmways. And the first thing they produced was an ABC weekend special called The Puppy's New Adventure. I think that was the first. And their first series was Fangface. So Ruby and Spears were no longer working for Hanna-Barbera. If you look up the date of when The Puppy's New Adventure was produced, by that point they were completely out of Hanna-Barbera. And so I don't think they were around when Scrappy-Doo was being discussed. Ultimately, later on, Ruby Spears' studio was acquired by Taft Broadcasting, which also owned Hanna-Barbera. So they merged back in together later on. But the time that Scrappy-Doo was done and that period when I started working for HB, Ruby Spears was a competitor. In fact, Ruby Spears was paying me better than Hanna-Barbera. And that was the proof right there they weren't the same studio. And Joe and Ken had a really good operation, and they did Plastic Man, and they did Thunder the Barbarian, and they did Mighty Man and Yuck, and they did Heathcliff later on. I mean, you can look all these up, the shows.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense too. I mean, if you're going to compete with Hanna-Barbera, right, if you want the artists and the writers, you got to pay them more. Make it more attractive.
Yeah. And they also Ruby Spears hired away Jerry Eisenberg, who was one of the most valuable guys at Hanna-Barbera, and he was the producer on the shows they did. And their shows, and Hanna-Barbera, and Ruby Spears was exclusive to ABC for the first few years of its existence. In order to punish is the wrong word.
Yeah, they got like the whole cartoon block, didn't they?
Yeah. What happened was that ABC was unhappy with Hanna-Barbera. They felt that Hanna-Barbera was spreading itself too thin, and they wanted a studio, that wanted to beat the other networks. See, Hanna-Barbera, if they were programming all three networks, they didn't care which show beat what show. If like I said, if they had the 9 o'clock show on all three networks, they didn't care which one won, and whichever show won was the Hanna-Barbera show.
Yeah.
So you wanted a studio that wanted to beat Hanna-Barbera, and so ABC made all these concessions to Ruby Spears to help them get in business, guaranteed them some shows, and bought much of their schedule from them. This is I'm simplifying something down because it's very complex at all these networks when different executives are fired and different people come in and they keep changing the game plan. The TV networks have always been very volatile places where the rules can change suddenly when a new vice president is hired or the old president is fired or whatever. But for extended period there, ABC was invested in the idea of Ruby Spears. They kept Scooby-Doo around because they couldn't get Scooby-Doo from Ruby Spears, but they bought Plastic Man and Mighty Man and Yuck and what else was on that show? The Rickety Rocket and a few other things, Fangface, from Ruby Spears, and gave most of their Saturday morning schedule to Ruby Spears for a year or two because they just wanted to get their shows from a studio that was exclusive to them and would give them all their best people instead of spreading them around among the NBC shows and the CBS shows. So, am I telling you anything that you wanted to know here?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is completely fascinating to me. I did a lot of research on my own. Yeah. I've spoken to people who've worked for Hanna-Barbera and read kind of everything I could find on your blog about Hanna-Barbera and Scooby. So I didn't want to go over a lot of the stuff that you'd already sort of said, but you are going in directions that I haven't seen covered in quite the same way, so I'm quite pleased with with the stories.
Okay.
So getting down to that first episode, The Scarab Lives.
Yeah.
You had said that, I believe it was on your blog, where you said that Joe basically, all the preamble with kind of getting into the office with Joe, and then Joe says, hey, I've got this new character, you should take a stab at it. So like all the development of what they wanted was already in place, and they needed that pilot script to kind of kick everything off and make the network happy.
Well, no, there was a lot. Well, what happened for a period of time there, I kept working for the different networks. I did this for all three networks at the time, where they'd have a show that had been developed, and 18 different people had written Bibles and scripts and done artwork, and then they'd say, this still isn't quite saleable. We still can't buy this show because it isn't quite there yet. And I'd be hired to turn it into a saleable show. I did that with Dungeons and Dragons for Marvel Productions. I did it with the Wuzzles for Disney. I did a few of this other shows where I took my name off the shows. And I'd look at all this stuff and I'd start throwing things away. And I'd say, no, we're not going to do that. That's a bad idea. Take that out. And I had the advantage that usually I came into the process at the last minute, so nobody could follow me. They either had to buy the show or not based on what I did. There wasn't time after me to have another person come in and do another pilot script. I was the last stop before the networks had to make their decisions for the season. So I took all the stuff, I read all the stuff that had been done on Scrappy-Doo, and it was all over the place. There was all different versions of him, and his character changed, and some of them he didn't talk, and some of them he did, and in some of them there were other supporting characters. There was a pilot script. There was a script written where there was a little girl who joined the troupe who was like Daphne's niece, and Scrappy was like her dog, and things like that. There were all these different takes on it and different approaches, and I just threw a lot of stuff out and reconfigured it, because the problem you get is when you start handing a show from person to person to person, this guy works on it 4 days, this guy works on it 5 days, you end up with a committee project and there's no one brainchild behind it. And somebody has to say, no, this is the show we're doing.
There's no unifying vision.
Yeah. The composer Stephen Sondheim once said the most important thing on any Broadway show is to make sure everybody's doing the same show. And somebody has to be there to say, no, this is not this show. This is not what this character would do. And there really wasn't anybody on Scooby-Doo at that point, because so many people were in charge of it over about 3 months of development. It went around, and finally it went around from person to person. So now I came in and I just said, okay, here's what we're going to do. And I wrote a bunch of Bibles and things and notes and stuff, and I made the case. And it was kind of a matter of the fact that Joe Barbera liked me and the people at ABC liked me. If you had to get both of those at the same time. Before I came along, there were a lot of stuff people did that Joe liked and the network didn't. And before I came along, there was a lot of stuff the network liked that Joe didn't. And I was the first one who pleased them both at the right moment, which was probably a certain amount of luck or last minute desperation. ABC didn't have the guts to cancel Scooby, and I gave them a reason to say, okay, they finally solved the story problems.
So you did a lot of massaging before you actually even just got to breaking down a script.
Well, pretty much. I mean, this was all done in a short period of time. I think for the time I came on the project, at the time ABC said we'll buy it, was about 3 weeks.
Oh, wow.
And then I hung around for a while as my script went through some more rewrites, and then went through the problem of casting Scrappy, and there were some more changes made to the show after that. But my jobs, I had succeeded the minute that they picked up the show. That was my job, was to get them to pick up the show, and they picked it up, and then later the show got tweaked a bit before it went into production. And I guess that was about 3 weeks from Joe Barbera had me come down. Joe was a part owner of an Italian restaurant called the Via Capri on Selma in Hollywood. A beautiful little Italian restaurant that, Frank Sinatra used to hang out there. And I went down, and it was like a scene out of The Godfather. Joe Barbera sitting at his table, the guy who co-owns the place, and Joe Barbera was a remarkable man. He was wonderful to be around. I didn't always agree with him. We argued at times. There were things that happened at the studio I didn't like, but I loved the guy. He was so adorable and funny and clever, and at times enormously human for a guy who had, 8,000 times more money than you did. And that's a conservative estimate. He was just a fabulous salesman. I used to tell people that if Joe Barbera had been a used car dealer, everybody in the world would own a 10-year-old Chevy. He was a fabulous film guy. He could sell anything. There's a famous story. Joe usually went into pitch meetings of the networks with a man named Cy Fisher, who was the agent for Hanna-Barbera. He's a very nice man, and he was the agent. He made the deals, and he'd go into the network, and Joe would pitch ideas, and Joe would be up there on his feet talking and ad-libbing and coming up with things. And if they were laughing, he would change the pitch a little bit to play to what they were laughing at. And if they didn't seem to like it, he would change the pitch in mid-sentence. He would start talking about, now this is a show set in the Old West. And he got scowls from the executive, and he said, of course, by Old West, I mean like just 5-10 years ago. He just keep changing the show around. And a lot of the weirder shows that came out of Hanna-Barbera were because Joe on the fly invented something out of nowhere. And, and he said, oh, we'll take this character from this show and put him in this show. And then everyone said, hey, that's a good idea. And the show was bought, and then we had to make it, or somebody had to make it.
That's what I heard is how Magilla Gorilla happened.
Yeah, probably. He was pitching, at one point he was pitching a show called The Space Angels, which was like a Charlie's Angels, like the Teen Angels and Caveman set in the future, a la Jetsons. And he was also at the same meeting pitching Casper, a new version of Casper. And the people at the network said, gee, we really want Casper, but we can only buy one show left. We kind of want Casper, but we also like those Space Angels. And Joe said, let's put them together, Casper and the Space Angels. And they said, you got a sale. And somebody had to take these two completely different shows and merge them together into one, which is, why, as I said earlier, there are some shows that just can't be any good. There's such rotten ideas to start with that you can't do anything. And I think that was an example of one. So this one time Joe was pitching stories to the network, ideas for shows to the network, and he tells this idea and this idea. And they're looking for primetime specials. And he pitches this idea and this idea. And finally, the executives like something, and they go, hey, that's great. We're going to buy that. We'll buy 2 1 hour specials based on that. And when the network says we'll buy it, that's when an agent like Cy Fisher springs into action. And the goal at that point is to get the hell out of the room. That's when Cy Fisher would look at his watch and go, oh my goodness, Joe, we're late for a meeting. Let's get out of here. You leave. Once you get the answer you want, you get the hell out of the building. Because if you stay, eventually they might change their minds. But if you walk out with a verbal commitment, then you can call up and you can talk to business affairs and make that a firm on-paper commitment, and then you go back and have the meetings where you discuss it further, once they're committed to it. So, this guy at the network says, we'll buy 2 hours, and Cy goes, oh, look at the time, Joe. We're late for the meeting. Come on. And they leave, and out in the parking lot, Cy says, congratulations, Joe, you did it again. And Joe says, okay, but which idea did they buy? And Cy says, I don't know. I thought you knew. Well, I'll call them tomorrow and find out. And the next day, Cy calls them up, and they say, before he can ask them, they say, oh, we're glad you called, Cy. Listen, we're going to honor the commitment, but we're not sure which of the ideas we committed to. So what Joe Barbera did that day, and if you're a salesman, this is the most fabulous thing you can do, he sold nothing. He got a network commitment for 2 hours of nothing. And then once they were committed, then they had to figure out what the shows were. And the shows wound up being those superhero roasts they did. Remember those?
I don't.
With Ed McMahon. Ed McMahon was in one of them. Adam West was in his Batman suit.
Yes.
Yeah. He had talked about superheroes. He had talked about roasts. He had talked about doing something like the Battle of the Network Stars that was then on, and he had, at various points, he was putting this idea with that idea, and at some point, the network guys were so enchanted they said yes, and they didn't know what they'd bought.
That's
That's the guy you're talking about here. This is who Joe Barbera was. He was an amazing man by any stretch. So was Bill Hanna too. Bill was amazing in more conventional ways. Bill Hanna was one of the hardest working human beings I ever saw in my life. If you had that kind of money, you wouldn't work that hard. But he was really determined to get the shows done and get them on time and get them on budget. And he worked harder than anybody in that place, always in shirt sleeves, always insisting you call him Bill, not Mr. Hanna. But the thing that was going on at this time was that, the Scrappy-Doo development, they thought was messy. I cleaned it up, as somebody else could have. I just happened to be the guy who got picked to be the last one. And sometimes that's a very nice position to be in, although you got to work real hard for... I didn't sleep a lot for those 3 weeks. Then we had to, now with everybody's committed to the new season of Scooby-Doo with Scrappy, now we've got to find a voice for Scrappy and start finding script ideas and stories like that.
So what led to the Scarab Lives? Was it just for expediency's sake? You went back to one of your older stories, or...?
Yeah, well, what happened was that I started developing the thing, and when you do a development, you have to come up with some sample story ideas. Just rough, 1, 2 paragraphs, and I was working very hard here. So I had to write 8 story ideas and have Scrappy in them. So I just plagiarized myself. I wrote 8 ideas up. I think probably 5 of them maybe I took from the comic books I'd done, because why not? And I made a couple new ones up.
They're your stories.
And the network people read all 8 ideas, or I don't even know the number. And they said, oh, let's do that one. And that was they liked that one the best. So that became the pilot episode for Scrappy. Sometimes these are very simple to process. I gave them 8 ideas, and they went, let's take the one on page 3.
Looking back at the original story today, I noticed how many changes had happened between that original and the television script, and I was curious sort of what precipitated those changes.
Well, I made a point of not reading the comic book over.
Oh, so you just did it from memory?
Yeah, well, I looked at the covers. I didn't read the story again because I wanted I didn't want to be stuck in anything I'd done for the comic book.
That's cool.
Because first of all, it was 7 or 8 years later, I think I was a better writer, and I didn't want to repeat any past mistakes. And I also thought, this is not a comic book anymore. This is a TV show. It's got a brand new character because Scrappy was not in the comic book version. So I've got to start over from scratch. I got to take the premise and make it work. So I didn't look at the comic book inside. I didn't open it up. I just wrote my 8 ideas. Like I said, maybe 4 or 5 of them were from comic books. I had 1 day to write 8 ideas. So I wrote 8 ideas in 1 day, and they picked one. So then from that point on, we developed the script. Something that some people listening to this may be interested in. One of the artists who worked in layout and was designing characters for that was a man named Mike Sikowski.
Yes.
Who had just started at Hanna-Barbera. Mike Sikowski was the guy who drew the Justice League of America in the early 60s. He drew Wonder Woman for a while for DC. He was an honest-to-God comic book artist, drawing this story about a comic book artist. and he drew a lot of little silly things in the background. So did my friend Scott Shaw, who worked a little bit on that story. Scott stuck some stuff on the comic book covers and things. There are a lot of little in-jokes that you may not see in there. If you could miraculously blow up some of the backgrounds, you'd see things on the wall that were inside jokes about the comic book industry.
I noticed there was a Yogi comic in the pile of comics that Scooby gets buried in. I wondered if that was a little Easter egg.
I'll bet Scott put it there. That would not surprise me. Scott was inking the Yogi Bear comic books. We were done with Yogi Bear comic books. He had inked the comic books for Chase and myself a few years before. And Scott was a big Yogi Bear fan, a big Flintstones fan.
Nice.
He and I were, Scott and I have been friends since we met at Jack Kirby's house in 1970, and we bonded by our love of, among other things, early Hanna-Barbera cartoons.
You simplified the characters. You changed the culprit from the competitor to it was the letterer or the colorist? It was Gruber.
I have no memory of
that.
Yeah.
It's always interesting talking to people this stuff is so far back in the past and just trying to remember it.
Yeah, if you look at my comic books over the years, there's always a character named Gruber in them. It's a name I like to use for often. I probably had 50 Grubers in there.
I noticed you used Gruber in your Indiana Jones story.
Oh, okay, yeah, there you go. Right. It's just I have a bunch of names I use. It's funny. I did a show for Ruby Spears that was a enormous flop cartoon show called Rickety Rocket, and I had to write 5 scripts in 1 week, no, week and a half. The show was so far behind schedule, they came to me and said, "Quick, just write scripts like crazy. Hey, give us anything." So I wrote 5 scripts. I just did first drafts, and somebody else in the studio rewrote what was necessary. And they had no credits on the individual episodes, and I lost my copies of the scripts or couldn't find them. So I never saw the shows for years, and they turned up one night on Boomerang or Cartoon Network, and I TiVo'd them all, recorded them all, and watched them, trying to figure out which ones I wrote. I could not remember. Literally, I'm sitting there watching these episodes, and all of a sudden I hear a character's name, Gruber, and I go, there's me, okay. And there's some of the other names I would repeat and things.
That's actually a really good idea, to have that one hook.
Yeah, it's just find your script. I just did the same thing with Goldie Gold. There's a show I wrote for Ruby Spears called Goldie Gold, and those had names on them. Those had credits on the individual episodes, but I didn't remember which ones I'd written, and they're all on YouTube, or they were on YouTube. And so I just kind of would instead of starting at the beginning and see if my name was on them, I'd start in the middle, watching them, and I'd listen until I heard something that sounded like me, and I go, okay, that's not me, and then I go to the front and see somebody else's name on the script, or I'd find my name on the script. Yeah, you can't remember these things very well sometimes.
How much more did you have going on when you were doing the Scrappy pilot development? Because you usually have a few things in the air.
Yeah, I was working for Sid and Marty Krofft at the time on one of their shows, so that was a full-time job. I was running the Hanna-Barbera comic books.
And I think you said on your blog that you'd written another pilot at the time as well.
Oh, yeah. I wrote a pilot actually, that season I wrote like 4 pilots for different Saturday morning shows. And it had come down to a pilot I'd written for Ruby Spears or Scooby-Doo. ABC had one slot left, and it was either going to go to the Ruby Spears show or to the Hanna-Barbera Scooby-Doo show. And they picked Scooby-Doo. So I aced out my own Ruby Spears show pilot. I did a lot of pilots back then. I did quite a few. I probably wrote 50 pilots over a period of 10 years for Saturday morning shows, and got quite a few on the air. But, you just, some of these are jobs that take almost none, you don't have much time. People ask me questions all the time about the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon show. And I really worked on that show from the time I called me on it to the time I wrote in the pilot script and the Bible that cost CBS to buy it, I think was 5 days.
Wow.
Something like that. Later I did some revisions of the script after they'd committed to it. But literally they called me up, CBS called me, and the lady named Judy Price at CBS, she said, "I've got this show called Dungeons and Dragons. I really want to buy it, but it's a mess. There's just too many other characters in it." And the show at that point had like 19 characters in it, and had all sorts of gimmicks and things like that. And they said, "Okay, send it over. Let me take a look at it." And I just threw stuff out. And, if I'd had 4 weeks to do it, I might have done something different. But I had to get a Bible in there in 3 days, and I had to write the pilot script in 2 more, I think it was, or something like that. I can't swear those exact numbers, but it was something like that. Because they had to set their schedule by a certain date, because they had to tell advertisers, here's what's going to be on our fall schedule. And we were past the day when they hoped to have their schedule set. And Judy is saying to me, I can't pick this show up without a pilot script that works and a Bible that I think we can produce from. And that's what my job was to do. And I did that, a bunch of, I did it with the Wuzzles at Disney. I did that with a bunch of shows. I did it with a lot of shows that didn't sell too. But the thing was, at that point, there was this selling season. And during the selling season, I'd write 3 or 4 pilots, 5 pilots, whatever it was. Sometimes I'd write pitch things, which, other people would develop into pilots. And I was freelance. I was never exclusive to any studio. Most of the good writers, or the writers the network liked, were exclusive to some studio, like Dwayne Poole and Tom Swale. I believe, were exclusive to Hanna-Barbera at that time.
Yeah.
And Dwayne and Tom were excellent writers. They were top guys who did great work. But the point was that the people at Marvel doing Dungeons and Dragons couldn't hire them. But I was a freelancer, and I was always a freelancer. We are coming up now on. We are weeks away from the 50th anniversary of my becoming a professional writer, and I've always been a freelancer for 50 years. I've had staff jobs, but I wasn't exclusive to anybody.
Yeah.
So while I was working for Sid and Marty Krofft, I could write an animation pilot for Ruby Spears. I could write an animation pilot for Hanna-Barbera. I could do the Hanna-Barbera comic books. At that point, we're done just doing the foreign editions. I did a pilot for Filmation. I did a pilot for DePatie Freeling or Marvel Productions. I mentioned that already. I did a pilot for Deke, a couple of pilots for Deke. I worked for everybody in town. And sometimes, it was, I was competing with myself. But I had the advantage that all three networks kind of liked me at that point.
That's a good problem to have.
Well, a couple of years later, nobody liked me. But every so often, you can get into those niches where, hey, it works for the moment. And I was enjoying it. I mean, I was working very hard, but I was enjoying it. But I did not spend a lot of my life. It's so interesting now that I do interviews about Dungeons and Dragons or Scrappy-Doo, because I didn't spend that much of my life on those shows.
Yeah.
And even with Scrappy, my involvement was only a couple of weeks, and then there was a couple of weeks after that where they called me in, and we'd go to meetings after the show was sold where the standards and practices people would say, Scrappy's too intense. We've got to tone him down. And I'd argue with them and try to defend Scrappy's personality and his functioning. And then a couple of times I was called in to consult when they were trying to pick a voice for Scrappy. Everybody in the world was the voice of Scrappy for about 5 minutes there.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah. And it wound up being Lenny Weinrib, who was a lovely man, good friend of mine, very funny man.
You mentioned on your blog how many people it kind of bounced through, and it instantly got me wondering about what different quality of voice, because everyone's going to do it a little bit differently, right? Like, did it all kind of sound like the way Scrappy is now and just was being done by different people, or were people trying like wildly different things?
No, I think they were. I heard a lot of different voices for Scrappy. I don't think any of them would have ruined the character. It was a matter of taste which was the best. I thought they were all pretty good. Frank Welker did an audition in which he ad-libbed the phrase puppy power. And Frank didn't get the job, but Scrappy got the catchphrase. And there was a period when Messick was going to do it, and there was a period when Dawes Butler was going to do it, and there was a period when Marilyn Schroeffler was going to do it, and there was a period when Paul Winch was going to. And in the article I wrote about this on my blog, I hope I made clear I wasn't necessarily remembering the order of these people that well.
Yeah.
I think Messick was the first one to audition for it and be picked for it, and I know Lenny was the last one because he did the first season. But the other ones, and there may have been others in there, and some of the people I mentioned may have been people who were strongly considered for 10 minutes. I suggested a couple of people, and they didn't audition them, I don't think they auditioned the people I wanted them to audition. But they wound up with Lenny, and it's a judgment call. If you were the head of the network, you might have picked a different voice, but you were with the head of the network, and the head of the network picked that one.
And then Lenny was out because he wanted to renegotiate his contract, right?
Lenny had a problem. Lenny was a lovely man. One of the people I really loved working with. I worked for Lenny on the Krofft Show, and Lenny was a guy who'd been around for years as a live action actor, and he was making a fortune in voiceovers and commercials. He was driving a green Rolls Royce around. Those are specially made. And if people don't know who Lenny Weinrib was, if you're familiar with the Dick Van Dyke Show, he was in 3 episodes of the original Dick Van Dyke Show. He's the guy that made Rob dismantle his phone and scream like a chicken. He's the guy who replaced Buddy Sorrell and insulted Mel Cooley, and so bad that Mel wanted Buddy Sorrell and he also played that comedian role in another episode. He was in a lot of TV shows. On the Munsters, he was on Love American Style. He was a semi-regular for a little while on Chips, I think. And he just did commercials after commercials. He worked constantly. And he was on a lot of Hanna-Barbera shows. He was on Hey, It's the King, and he was on the Addams Family. He was with the first Addams. They did 2 animated Addams Family. He was Gomez in the first one of those. He was Inch High Private Eye. He was, for Crofts, he was H.R. Pufnstuf in several of their star characters. And in fact, he wrote a lot of the Pufnstuf scripts, the original show. And Lenny was going through some problems in his life, and he got a little hard to deal with. He got a little testy. He was a little angry a lot at things. He got swindled by a business manager. His business manager cheated him, and he didn't get that money back. And he got very angry about that. And at Hanna-Barbera at the time, the voice sessions were being directed by a man named Gordon Hunt, who was a great voice director and a very decent, lovely man.
Yes.
I direct cartoon voices a lot, and almost everything I know about that I learned watching Gordon direct, and he was excellent at it. But he and Lenny just came to blows over things. They just didn't get along, and part of the problem after the first season was that Lenny and Gordon weren't getting along, and part of the problem was that Lenny wanted more money. So one day they said to Lenny, well, if Gordon Hunt doesn't direct you, who would you like to do it? And he said, why don't you get Mark Evanier? I can get along with him. So I get called into Bill Hanna's office, and he says, we'd like you to direct Scooby-Doo, voice direct Scooby-Doo this year. Because at this point, they thought Lenny was going to do the second season. And I said, what about Gordon Hunt? Isn't that his job? And he says, well, Gordon, Lenny and Gordon aren't getting along. And I said, well, I want to check. I don't want to steal Gordon's job, or I don't want to take away from Gordon's job. Let me go talk to Gordon, and if he says it's okay, I'll do it. So I went down to Gordon's office, and I said, Gordon, they've asked me if I will voice direct Scooby-Doo this year. And he said, oh, please, take it away from me. Please do it. I can't work with Lenny anymore. So I went back, and they made a deal with me to voice direct that second season of the show with Lenny as repeating as Scrappy. And then they got into the part of the negotiations about how much money Lenny would be paid. And Lenny, for some reason, threw out this huge dollar figure, and Bill Hanna said, nah, let's keep Gordon Hunt, and let's keep, we'll get Don Messick to do it. And nobody bothered. At that, for some reason, Messick wasn't acceptable as Scrappy the first season, and he was fine the second. Because, the people change, as I mentioned earlier. It's a volatile business. What's right this week may be wrong next week.
Yeah. And
they also found out that they would have to pay me to be the voice director of that season, and they couldn't just deduct it from Gordon's salary. Somebody noticed this. So it was going to cost them more for me, and it was going to cost them more for Lenny. And, Bill Hanna, like I said, a lovely man at times, but he kind of, if you said, you got to spend a little more money, he would clutch his heart and stagger around like Red Fox on Sanford and Son. He just didn't like spending the money. And it was fine with me. I didn't want to do it that badly. So Messick did it after all.
You mentioned Frank ad-libbing the puppy power, and when I spoke to Dwayne, he recalled Joe coming up with the catchphrase in one of the early meetings. And now, when I brought up your Scrappy Days articles, he said I would probably trust Mark's recollection more than I would trust my own.
Yes, well,
Mark's a wonderful person and has a great memory for these things.
Yeah.
But I figured if I ever got the chance to talk to you, I'd throw that out there and see what you said.
I remember specifically that Welker came up with it, and Joe Barbera said, "Oh, that could be like when Alan Reed ad-libbed Yabba Dabba Doo in his audition. It was like, he thought it was another one like that. I don't think Puppy Power had the same staying power as Yabba Dabba Doo, but I remember pretty well. I got a pretty good memory, for things like that.
Yeah.
Ask me my driver's license number. I can't tell you, but I can remember, who inked what comic book in 1963, and details of that stuff. Yeah, I would stand behind my memory of Welker having ad-libbed it. Frank Welker is an amazing, talented man, and he did lots and lots of stuff he never got credit for. He was so prolific. He was in so many shows, and nobody has a bad word about him.
Yeah.
You can do these podcasts for the rest of your life, and you will not find anybody with a bad word about Frank Welker. Yeah. In fact, eventually come back to me, and I'll make up something for you, because no one ever thought Frank was not brilliant and talented and easy to work with. And he kind of set this. One of the things that when Lenny got a little hard to work with, he got a little sabotaged by the fact that Frank Welker had set a new standard for voice actors being cooperative. I'm serious about that. A lot of voice actors learned how to behave in a session by watching Frank, because he was the guy who worked more than anybody. He was so good at what he did, and it wasn't just the voices that came out of his mouth. It was the professionalism, the responsibility. He was on time. He didn't. Even though he might have 5 other sessions to rush to, he stayed there and did his job. He was nice to everybody else. I would call Frank sometimes to book him for something, and he'd say, listen, I got a friend who's really hard up for a job. Why don't you give this to him? And if he doesn't do what you want, I'll come by and redo it for nothing. He was so nice about other people, completely non-competitive, never knifed anybody in the back for a job ever. And he worked incessantly. To this day, his agents turn down, 20 offers for every one he accepts.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, I won't tell you the name of the actor, but there was a voice actor who got fired. Basically, the studio said, we don't want him anymore. He's too much trouble. He was having temper tantrums in sessions. He was insulting people. He was just being impossible. And his career went ice cold. And he came to me one day and he said, I can't get a job anywhere. Can you give me a couple jobs on Garfield, which I was directing? And I just need a job someplace just to remind the business I'm alive. So I hired him, and in the session I put him next to Frank Welker, and he watched, and he got the message. He figured out what I was doing. I put him at the microphone next to Frank, and he watched Frank. And in terms of, it wasn't like learning how to do voices from Frank, although people could. It was like learning how to conduct yourself at a session, and how to be nice to everybody and to be friendly and such. And the guy, the voice actor who was in trouble, called me afterwards, and he said, first of all, thank you. A couple of people said, well, if Evanier can work with him, maybe we can. And they started giving him work again. But he said, and the other thing is I figured out why you put me next to Frank, because that's the guy I should have been behaving like. I should have learned from him. So, I mean, that's, everybody listening to this who's watched cartoons knows how many shows. Well, you probably don't know how many shows Frank was on, because the credits never showed you that he was. And some of those things he did 33 voices. But I've had people come to me and they said, "Oh, I hear Welker all the time in your shows." And I said, "Really? Yeah." In the recent episode, I spotted the 5 voices he did. I said, well, you missed 4 other ones, because he's so good at those things. And people know how wonderful he is, but you don't know how good he is in the sessions and as a person. And I don't say that about a lot of people. I mean, there's a reason that guy has worked incessantly since he got in the business.
Yeah.
And and the fact that he's good at the microphone is only part of it. So.
And that brings to a close part 2 of my conversation with Mark Evanier. I hope you guys are enjoying the way things are going. I really like how it's turning out. I did it so long ago, I've actually forgotten a lot of the finer details. So as I'm editing it, I'm kind of experiencing it all for the first time again, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. I am finding actually that in the time since I conducted the interview and now, there's other stuff that I've kind of delved into and learned, and I'm thinking of so many questions I could have asked Mark that I didn't, which I'm sad about, but such is life. Anyways, like I said, I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you are interested in Mark and you want to follow him beyond the podcast, you can find him online. He is on Facebook at facebook.com/Evanier. Mark has a Twitter account where his handle is @Evanier. Evanier, all lowercase. He's also on Instagram at Mark Evanier, full name, lowercase. And Mark has recently started a series of webcasts, YouTube interviews, where he's having conversations with people that he knows in the industry. Voice artists, other writers, generally people Mark knows in the industry. I think it's something that he's doing primarily as everyone's in COVID quarantine, and the conventions are all canceled, and he's used to moderating a lot of panels. Mark's usually quite in demand during convention season. Yeah, they're all, they run like an hour and a half, 2 hours. Some really interesting people. And if you're interested in comics, animation, comedy, television, I would definitely go check it out. It is News From Me TV, which is basically the same title as his blog, which I forgot to mention. He has a blog, newsfromme.com. And News From Me TV on YouTube will get you to the channel with all of these interviews. And, if you're in quarantine too, it could be a great way to spend some time just learning some new stuff, hearing some new voices. Yeah. If you want to get in contact with my show, with this show, if you want to let me know what you think of the episodes, if you want to pat me on the back, if you want to tear me a new one, whatever it is you want to do, there's a few ways to get into contact with me. I'm on Facebook, facebook.com/ScoobyDooCast. You can email me at scoobypodcast@gmail.com. I'm on Instagram, a podcast named Scooby-Doo. There's the WordPress Scooby-Doo blog, which is scoobydoocast.wordpress.com, which is where you can find my Apocalypse Variations interviews, where I do short interviews with people who have done covers or variant covers for the Scooby Apocalypse comic book series. Should have a new one coming out soon. Tracking down some of these folks is going a little slower than I thought. I thought these would be coming out a lot more regularly than they are, but it is what it is, and it's great when someone agrees to do it, and it's always fun to go and check them out. And I've got a few other ideas for the blog as well. I won't get into it, but I might have some more text interviews popping up on the blog, so I'll let you guys know when that happens, and you can usually find that out. What a great segue. I'm almost getting good at this. On my Twitter account, which is at ScoobyDooCast. I'm probably most active on Facebook and Twitter, so check me out there. Touch base with me. Like, follow, share, subscribe on all the social media. Oh, and YouTube. There's a YouTube channel as well. If you prefer to get your media through YouTube, check out the podcast there. If you're a newcomer to the show, also be sure to check out the APNSD extras, which basically when we have people come onto the show, some of them like to record audio commentaries to go with episodes that they were involved in. Had some cool people. Victor Cook from Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated, Tom Conkle and John Colton Berry, who were responsible for some Be Cool Scooby-Doo episodes, and there's more in the works. There's more coming. So if that's something that you really dig, be sure to check that out as well. I don't know why I'm doing this. I think I'm just deciding to kind of promo like everything just in case there's new people coming in. I've noticed a lot of clicks lately. My numbers are higher than normal, so this is probably just a good opportunity to get some of this stuff out at the end, and it's at the end, so people who don't want to hear this have already clicked out, marked as played, and they've moved on to something else. So for those of you who've stuck around, thank you so much. Thank you for your support. Thank you for downloading and taking the time to listen to this stuff that I'm doing. Yeah, be sure to come back next time for part 3. I'll be sure to update the social media, as I said. Let you guys know when part 3 is coming out. And that's all I got. So take care, stay cool, and remember...
She flew around instilling fear. Exactly how she did was still unclear until we saw the broken flight rig of the balladeer, whose name is Kyle! Kyle! The hovering balladeer! Kyle! Everybody cheer! This is how we solve the mystery. This is how we solve the mystery. So in summation, this narration's my donation to the art of mystery solving dictation. And here's what the bad guys say when they play where the law forbids.
Would have gotten away with it too. if it wasn't for you meddling kids.
This is how we solve the mystery. Bye.